Thank you, Heidi. I'm here with Joe Bumbacco from what we call Old Sault. Now, many of you don't know what that is, and I appreciate that. I only came across it probably, 6 months ago even?
Yeah.
He works hard to bring old history of the Sault back so people can see it. I know a lot of people appreciate what you do, but why do you do what you do?
Honestly, it's something I fell in love with when I was living in Toronto a couple of years ago. So I was there for about 7 years, fell in love with the architecture and the history of the city, and when I decided to move back to the Sault, kind of had new eyes for it, and so it was basically like looking at the city I grew up in a completely different way.
So out of all the stories you've done, I think I counted over 40 anyway, between your Instagram and your Facebook and everything else, what is the most interesting piece of history that you've uncovered for yourself about the Sault?
Oh, Lord. There's a lot, but honestly, there's quite a bit to do with the streetcars that I've always found particularly interesting, and especially since that was something I never knew when I was younger, but always like what happened to them afterwards. Were they scrapped? Were they sold? I've heard stories that they were buried somewhere out in like town limits and stuff like that, so it's always been a bit of a mystery.
So on that note of streetcars, and before we started talking here, we were talking about Queen Street, which we can see behind you, and how it used to be so much wider, and the thought that they do want to bring trolley cars back to the Sault, which is an idea that's been floated a few times now. What were you saying about Queen Street and why that might be a little more difficult now?
Honestly, I always thought it was mostly because Queen Street is a lot narrow these days compared to back then, considering the like open city mall in the 80s that they did, which pretty much narrowed everything down a bit for more walking room, is when they did the tree planters and everything like that. So these days, I'm not saying it's not feasible, but I think you'll have a lot of traffic frustrations.
We already have traffic frustrations downtown, and we're just going to add more, which wouldn't be the end of the world, but still, some drivers it would be. So we talked last week or a couple weeks ago now about saving some of the heritage buildings and a petition that you had done. Why don't you explain to the viewers a little bit about what that petition was for and what you're hoping to accomplish by it?
So basically what I was trying to accomplish was there's about 4 properties, including the Windsor Hotel, which has a couple buildings in the complex that are significantly older than the tower block that they are considering saving or like have been saved. And what I want to do is basically bring more awareness to the public about these issues and show that if there's enough support behind something like this, something can be done, because we've gone a lot of years, and especially in the last 4 years that I've been back here, we've lost a lot of heritage structures, or structures that should have been deemed heritage worthy.
So we know it went to council. We know it's gone to the Heritage Committee. Your petition with almost 600 different signatures has been seen by council. There hasn't been decisions made on some of the properties you asked for. Why do you think keeping the heritage is important?
It's a link to our past. It's the one way we can look back and truly, I think, have a tangible connection with those who came before us. And especially with a lot of the older architecture and the older buildings in the city, they're built to last. They're not going anywhere if you take good care of them. As long as they have some tender loving care behind them, they can last for another 100 years easy.
And what do you say to the critics that say, well, it takes a lot of money to renovate these buildings and everything else, and sometimes they're better to be torn down so we can put newer buildings there? Because I know you've seen the critics. I see the critics every time I put something with old buildings. It's like, but they take a lot of money to keep that way, but there's something to be said for that investment, right?
It really does, and I understand it does take a lot of money to especially restore something that's been kind of left to just sit there for decades or just a couple of years at a time. But I think it does warrant a discussion instead of just leaving it to like, well, if you want to do it, why don't you just buy it? It's like, well, not everybody can do that, but people care about these places. These places have a part, and not only in our history, but in the memories of those who still live here, who have been there through the times that they were at their peak.
The city's considering doing a standard facade, which is the front property. You'll know what I mean by that.
Yeah.
The front of the buildings on Queen Street kind of all having a standard look, kind of a bit like they did early 30s, 40s type idea, where it had the canopies and it all looked alike. Do you think that would bring some more awareness to the heritage of the city if they went back to something like that?
Absolutely, I think they do, and especially if it's something that entails having hanging neon signs once again or something like that. It's always something I hear people talk about. It's what they miss the most about Old Queen Street, just the old advertisements, businesses really putting themselves out there to be seen. And not only that, but just having it just adds to the aesthetic of the downtown core.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Joe. We'll definitely have you in again to talk about other old buildings and get your stories that you have out there. We're going to try and get them out onto Sioux Online too as you write them.
Awesome.
So
Thank you for having me.
back to you, Heidi, over in the studio.